Hey y'all, welcome back to the New Alabamian. Today I have a special guest. I have my friend Pastor Daylan Woodall, and he preaches at First Missionary Baptist Church in Decatur. I'm gonna go in and we're gonna have a chat. We're gonna talk about a lot of things. Today was the Scottsboro Boys event, and we're also gonna talk about Juneteenth. Juneteenth is under attack from the current administration in the United States. They want to whitewash our history and pretend that this day that gave millions of people their freedom is something that didn't happen or not draw attention to it. Juneteenth is when Texas was forced to free their slaves. And this is a big deal. This marks the end of slavery in America. So we don't need to whitewash history. We don't need to try to replace Juneteenth with Donald Trump's birthday. We need to acknowledge the real history. And Juneteenth was only recently made a federal holiday. It's been carried on for decades, years, by the African American community as this acknowledgement of like, this is when people were free. And it has only more recently entered the mainstream, but that doesn't make it any less valuable. We need to acknowledge that this is Freedom Day for millions of people and all of their family that came after them. Hey guys, this is Trent here. I'm here with my friend Daylan Woodall. He's a pastor over at First Missionary Baptist Church in Decatur. He, in this church, have a lot of history and knowledge, and I'm just going to talk to him today and let him introduce himself a little more.
Yeah, absolutely, Trent. It's great to be here with you and your audience. I'm Daylan Woodall. I'm the senior pastor at First Missionary Baptist Decatur. It is a church that was founded in 1866. We worship in a sanctuary that was built in 1921. It's a church that for a very long time has been the heartbeat of the African American community and has played a significant role in Alabama history, civil rights history writ large. It's an honor to serve as senior pastor here, and it's an honor to talk with you today.
Thank you. It's good to see you again. I've known Daylan for several years now at this point.
Sure.
And he's very knowledgeable, and I'm just going to pick his brain. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the role that this church played in a lot of the history, especially on the Scottsboro Boys case? Because today there was an event that was going through the history of that and what it means like to stand up with courage even when everybody else is doing the wrong thing. And this was a case that went on for decades that just was bad for everybody involved.
So before we can get to the Scottsboro Boys trial, I always like to talk about the historical foundations of our church, right? And so 1866 is a year after the Civil War. The country is moving toward a period of time that will be known as Reconstruction. It is during the time in which the country is reckoning with the causes and the consequences of the Civil War and trying to determine how to make its way out of this national fog, out of this national crisis, out of this conflict that has come about to determine the personhood of millions of people that were born here, brought here, existed in a condition of servitude here. Those are the national circumstances that the church is founded in a country that is still trying to come to grips with their personhood, with their rights, with the level at which they can be involved in the project of democracy and overall the project of citizenship. It is in a crisis kind of moment. But in spite of that crisis kind of moment, the 21 former slaves who organized this church and Alfred Peters, their first pastor, had a reason to be hopeful. The clarity, the moral clarity and moral bravery that came from their convictions as Christians and as believers motivated them to build something, notwithstanding all of the threats, motivated them to do something with and do something out of that bravery, notwithstanding all of the risk. And that's the foundation, right? To understand our history well and appropriately and accurately is to understand that these are people who had very little in terms of education, who had very little in terms of economic access, who enjoyed very little in terms of sociological privilege, But in spite of all of those disadvantages and in spite of all of the risk that would come in trying to build something meaningful and do something meaningful, they undertook that incredibly important work. And that's the historical foundation of our church, but also that's the ethos of our church and our community. Finding the motivation to do something worthwhile, regardless of how long the odds look, regardless of how discouraging the prospects look, regardless of how difficult the work before you ultimately is. And that ethos is what follows all the way through to 1930 and the Scottsboro Boys. The same thing that led people to organize a church, to establish a church, despite all of the headwinds against them, is the same thing that leads members in this church and members in this community to engage in the Scottsboro Boys trial as citizens who at the same time are motivated to bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice and get involved, to not sit on the sidelines of history. The church plays a very specific and very strategic role in the Scottsboro Boys case. The attorney, Mr. Leibowitz, understands that African Americans are being excluded from juries and jury roles. And what he does is, meeting with the African American community here in Decatur at the church, he begins to put a list together of people who would otherwise be qualified were they not Black. But signing that list was an existential risk. It was a risk of economic wealth. It was a risk of the social standing that had been accumulated. It was a risk of everything that people had sacrificed their whole lives to build. Raising your hand and say, I would be willing to serve as a juror were I not being excluded, was an extraordinary risk.
And at that time, there was still the real risk of being lynched, too.
Absolutely.
So not just your social standing, but your very life and of your family.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to sort of zoom out a little bit and sort of contextualize this work in the wider sweep of history, our church shares an architect, Wallace Augustus Rayfield, second licensed African-American architect in American history, is the same architect who built 16th Street, which is bombed for their participation and their organization and their involvement in the civil rights movement, right? That happens 30 plus years after. And so the same risk, right, that was undertaken and ultimately resulted in those young girls losing their lives, this community being attacked, and Birmingham becoming known as Bombingham, was very much present in Decatur. The Ku Klux Klan marches down the street in front of the church to intimidate the community in the silence. Crosses are burned in Northwest Decatur. And in spite of that environment, people are still showing up at this church to learn more about the case. The church still has the moral clarity to understand participating in this as an outgrowth of their responsibility as believers who are interested in justice and righteousness. And people in this community will refuse to be intimidated into silence.
As Christians, we should have a strong sense of justice and fairness and what it means to be human and not to dehumanize others. So I guess the church was standing up at the case. My generation probably doesn't know a lot about this unless they go look for it themselves. I don't know how much this is currently taught in schools, but I know I didn't really learn a lot about it. If you gave like the 1-minute synopsis of what the Scottsboro Boy case was to someone who had never heard of it, how would you explain it?
A group of young men are unjustly accused of a heinous act as a result of social convenience. Two young ladies are trying to get out of trouble, and they accuse a group of young men of the heinous act of sexual assault. And because of I'm well over a minute now.
You're fine, keep going.
But because of the poisonous and toxic social, racial, political circumstance of the 1930s, they are never able to receive a fair trial by a jury of one's peers. They never enjoy the presumption of innocence. They are, I think one historian says, outside the protective circle of humanity. So I guess if I had to describe it in 1 minute, now that I've described it in more than 1 minute, I would say the Scottsboro Boys trial is a trial about a group of people who were always outside the protective circle of humanity.
a lot of people may not realize that this is the reason that we have like jury by your peers now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's not just legal language, right? That is a sort of foundational legal principle that reflects a society that is committed to striving for equality and justice. And moreover, that the existence of that legal doctrine and that legal idea does not come without extraordinary fight, extraordinary sacrifice, and the willingness of people to take extraordinary risk and make themselves uncomfortable.
So, to me, I can't help but look at the things that have happened in history and see where it rhymes with what's happening now. I look at people saying, well, the judge at the time that tried to prevent somebody from being, that was innocent, from being sentenced to death, he lost his position. And people now say, well, he stood up and he did the right thing. But people now, it doesn't look like, are willing to stand up in a lot of areas. And that just drives me crazy. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, every challenge that we face is an examination of what our values really are. If we value our privilege and our comfort and our ease and the status quo more than our responsibility to do the right thing, change will never be made. If we care more about our comforts and if we care more about avoiding discomfort, change will never be made. Change only happens in a society. Change only comes in a society when people value truth and doing the right thing and making the right decision. When people have moral clarity and moral courage, and that moral clarity and moral courage is stronger than their temptation to maintain the status quo or not assume any risk. Nothing meaningful ever happens in society, in the world, in our community, and even in our individual lives without assuming risk. And refusing to assume risk, refusing to move away from the status quo, consistently choosing the status quo, is the choice to allow things to remain as they are.
Would you like to comment on any of the gerrymandering and all the special sessions that Alabama has been trying to do?
The franchise is a generational goal for the people who organized this church in 1866, for the people that are building this physical facility in 1921. It's the reason that generations of African Americans are willing to subject their bodies to the fire hose, to the German Shepherd, to the scorn, to the vitriol, to the condition of being second-class citizens, ultimately toward the end of demonstrating, again, because it's demonstrated in the Civil War, it's demonstrated in World War I and World War II, but demonstrating again that this country is our country too, and that our voices are equal voices and not lesser voices, that our lives are equal lives and not lesser lives, that our issues are pressing issues and not less important issues. And I think change in society isn't really possible without a full accounting of the sacrifices that have to be made for change to happen in society. And so when I think about voters' rights and I think about the franchise and I think about disenfranchisement and I think about all of the political and cultural mechanisms that were responses to those things, I think we have a very impoverished view of what was given if we allow that to characterize our national life, our political life. We have a really cheap view of the sacrifices that were made if we take this land down.
I agree with that. I've looked at it like people hear about we the people, and our founders of this country had their own prejudices and biases. They owned slaves at the time, so they put forth this document that we all we all say this is our goal. And so I think it's aspirational. We the people is supposed to include everybody. And I think that it's basically just been a fight to get that to be including all of us like it's supposed to, and not just either the wealthy or the widest or whoever owns land. And that it's supposed to be aspirational, and that it's a fight we always have to have.
We wrestle with a sense of historical schizophrenia, particularly in Alabama. I think the state seal of Alabama acknowledges both that it is the birthplace of the Confederacy or the cradle of the Confederacy and the birthplace of civil rights.
I think that sounds right.
And that perfectly captures these frictions that characterize our political life and our public life. Whether or not we will move toward the better angels of sacrifice and service and drawing a broader circle inclusive of more humanity, or whether we'll move in the opposite of that kind of direction and succeed and reseed and become smaller in our thinking and more narrow in our thinking. And I think that's a challenge that has always been before us and is ever before us.
So today was June 20th and yesterday was Juneteenth. This is a big time of the year. This is basically this is Independence Day for the African American community. I've talked to people and it's called the Juneteenth Freedom Day. So what does that really mean for you out here in Alabama?
You can't think about freedom without thinking about the sacrifices that it takes to secure freedom. In some ways, our founders are incredibly prescient about this, and in some ways they are extraordinarily blind. The tree of liberty, I think Jefferson says, has to be refreshed with the blood of patriots, right?
Yeah.
And so in saying that, Jefferson captures the way in which freedoms are not sustained or attained without sacrifice, right? And that same person owned slaves and kept people in a condition of involuntary servitude and bondage. What Juneteenth causes me to think about, and I think what Juneteenth causes us to reflect on, is the extraordinary cost that have been paid for us to have freedom and that must be paid for us to keep it. On the pillars of Dr. King's parsonage, or the Dexter parsonage in Montgomery that Dr. King lived in during the time he was serving as pastor at Dexter, there are scars from the bomb that exploded when people placed an explosive device at his home, feet away from the piano where his daughter taught his children music, feet away from the television where he sat with his daughter Yolanda on his knee and explained to her why she couldn't go to Funtown, a day that he describes as the saddest day in his life. Those scars testify of the extraordinary cost that has to be paid and that we must be willing to pay. It testifies of the extraordinary debt of appreciation we owe people who sacrificed their very lives and their comfort because they were motivated by moral courage and because they had moral clarity. It challenges us that there's no such thing as a comfortable freedom.
I agree with that. We can't just sit on our butts and expect things to happen. And
not good things.
we can't sit on our butts and expect things to go our way. We
Right.
have to get out. We have to work for it. We have to figure out where we're needed. And I think, to me, I feel a sense of responsibility to go out and try to do what I can when I see problems.
Right.
I hope other people feel that way too, but I don't see it as much anymore.
Right. Well, I hope that people are continually inspired and motivated by the spaces and places in our history that remind us that common people, ordinary people, are capable of uncommon courage and extraordinary deeds when they are properly motivated, when they have the moral courage they need and the moral clarity that they need.
Well, Pastor, I really appreciate this, and it's always good to catch up with you.
Always is.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
So.